Hello and welcome to my November reading wrap-up. I read 16 books in November, so it's not going to be quite as brutal as last month's wrap-up, but on the other hand, 8 of the books that I read last month were for the same series, whereas this month they were, I think, all standalones. So more to talk about individually, I guess. But I'm just gonna get into those. And the first book I read is my most anticipated release of the year that I was on hold for at the library forever. And then I went to a different library and they just had a copy on their shelf. So I read After That Night by Karin Slaughter, which is what book is it? Book 11 in the Will Trent series. And yes, I am looking down on my computer because actually, for the first time in a minute, I wrote reviews for all of these, so I have notes. So like I said, After That Night is book 11 in the Will Trent series, which is an adult cop thriller series written by Karin Slaughter. It is my favorite of the thriller series. I love them. They're so much fun. They're so dark and so twisted and so brutal. Karin Slaughter is known for her absolute brutality. And this book follows Will Trent's girlfriend. Actually, she's the main character of this book, as she runs across some old friends of hers from medical school, and it kind of draws into a traumatic event that happened in her past when she was in medical school with these friends. And then you see a lot of twisted things that are happening in the present. It is very hard to describe the plot of this book because so much of it is just like things that have happened over the past 10 books of this series, but also the 6 books of the Grant County series, which take place before this series. So there's a lot to get up to in this book, but it's so much fun. I gave it 4 stars. It was just like an absolute fun ride. It's so well written. She's just fantastic at like actual writing, and her writing itself is so brutal. Just like her words and her language like kind of adds to the brutality of her books so well. And it was just like as good as this possibly could have been. I did think it was going to be about something different based on the description, so I had to adjust my expectations a lot. And I did kind of have a little bit suspension of disbelief problem with this one because Sarah Linton has been a main character for like a minute now. I've been reading from her, and they were talking about these friends she had from med school. And the friends were just so different from her and valued such different things from her that I had a really hard time buying into her being friends with them. It just didn't seem like it fit within her character. And what we know of her character, even from like her past, it just didn't make sense. And then there needed to be more Will Trent. I'm in this series for Will Trent, and I like following Sarah Lynn, but Will Trent is kind of like the god of the series, and this book had very little of him, which I found a little bit unfortunate, but fantastic book, fantastic continuation of the series. I've been looking forward to this since I caught up to the series a couple years ago, so I am glad that this like lived up to all my expectations. And then I read Endymion Spring by Matthew Skelton, which is a middle grade fantasy book set partially in present day and partially in the Middle Ages. This was recommended to me for my 12 book project by Matilda Gothica, who I will link down below. But this was an interesting book. It was so unique. It's about a young boy in present day who comes across this book that's kind of calling to him, but other people also want the book. And at the same time, he's dealing with his parents' divorce. And it's kind of just about like the magic of that book and his life. And it's very, very interesting. I gave it 3 stars, and I do think that's largely just because it's not the book for me, but it was very well written, and I really enjoyed the humanity of the kid, the main character of this book. I loved his family and their relationships, and how much of the magic was just kind of like a vehicle for his healing within his family, as his parents are like struggling in their marriage and he's feeling very distant from his father, and it was just like really well done in that regard. My biggest issue was that I didn't feel like there was enough time spent in the past, because in the Middle Ages timeline you're actually seeing the creation of this book. I believe it was a little bit hard to follow at times, but you're seeing like the origin story of this book and a young boy in the past who is kind of involved in the creating of this magic and what the book means. And there just wasn't enough of that, and I wish there had been more of that, because I felt like the historical timeline was so interesting, and I also felt like the magic was a little bit confusing, and I would have liked more clarification. But it was like such an interesting and well done book. And if you do like middle grade books that are just like for people who love books, that's just kind of like about libraries and about the magic of books, I think this is a really good one. It's just not something that I personally gravitate towards. Then I read Let Us Water the Flowers by Jafar Yaghoobi. This is a memoir of a man who was a political prisoner in Iran in the 80s, and specifically in 1988. There was a lot of murder of political prisoners, like mass graves, absolutely horrifying, and it was kind of culminating in that, but it was a lot about just Yaghoobi's time being a political prisoner and what it was like in the prison system. I give this 3 stars, and my biggest issue was that it was just so dry and so dull and just so day-to-day of prison life. Like, I genuinely couldn't tell you what he actually did to get arrested and wind up in prison. And like, not that I'm saying it was justified or anything, like the man was a political prisoner, but you never really understand what he was doing or what he was like campaigning for or working towards. Like, because he talks about like the groups he was kind of involved in, but I have no idea what his role was or what he was doing. And maybe that was just like he's trying to keep it hidden because Iran is still like a thing and he just doesn't want to like incriminate other people, like it wasn't that long ago. But it was kind of really hard to follow. And then there's just so much day-to-day of prison life, like what he ate every day, what cell he was in, what his cell was like, how he changed cells, and like why they were changing cells, and the process of changing cells, and who his new roommates were, and then what they ate for dinner that day. And it was just kind of constant like minutia. So like, if you are interested in what it was like to be a political prisoner in Iran in the 80s, like what it was like to be in the prisons and like what happened to the prisoners, fantastic resource. As a book, it was kind of difficult to read, but its saving grace was really the final third, when he did start to really focus on the state-sponsored killings and the mass murder of political prisoners in 88, because that part of the book felt like it had a really good focus, and it felt like he was finally doing something, you know, like the book had a purpose and he was telling this story for a reason, whereas up until that point it was just kind of like, well, this is what I did. I woke up, I ate breakfast, this is what we ate, this is how it was served. And then with the killings, he was actually talking about the government as a whole and what it was like, and the emotion and the fear, and then what it meant in the greater scheme of things. And it just had this absolute power to it that like I wish the rest of the book had. It was just like this one small section was so incredibly worthwhile, and then the rest of the book was kind of a struggle. But I do think it's worthwhile if you're specifically interested in this. I do think I got a lot out of reading it, but it was very difficult to get through. Then I listened to In the Heart of the Sea, The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex by Nathaniel Philbrick, which is a nonfiction book about the whale ship Essex and how it sank. This was apparently kind of some inspiration of Moby Dick, which I didn't know, but it was kind of interesting. Like, not that Moby Dick was based on this, it was just like mild inspiration for it. But essentially, they were just a whale ship out of Nantucket in the 18-something hundreds going out to kill whales for their oil, and a whale rammed their ship multiple times and it sank, and they wound up in lifeboats and then mostly wound up eating each other. So kind of a brutal book. I gave it 4 stars. It was really, really interesting. I learned a lot. I didn't really know much about this, and apparently I'm into like shipping boat stuff, which wouldn't have pegged that as like an interest of mine. But I've read several nonfiction books about like maritime disasters, and I really enjoyed the vast majority of them. But I don't have tons to say on this book. Like, it was an interesting account. Like, Nathaniel Philbrick did a lot of really great research into like the various survivor accounts, because like a few people survived it, and he really kind of went in depth on like figuring out what really happened, because like the accounts somewhat differed, and like kind of going into like local legends and what happened to the survivors after. And it was just like an absolutely fascinating account. A little bit brutal. There was a lot of like descriptive cannibalism, which would have been okay, except I was like trying to eat breakfast when I was listening to it, which was unfortunate, but it was, I don't know, it was 4 stars. It was really good. Then I read Hidden Valley Road: Inside the Mind of an American Family by Robert Kolker, which is a nonfiction book about a family in Colorado, and mostly like it's centered around the 80s, but you know, through the second half of the 20th century. They had 12 children, and 6 of those children were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and their genes were kind of studied at a point to like kind of investigate whether like schizophrenia like has a hereditary element, or like it does, but like how much that matters, and like if they could figure out anything about like the elements. Very interesting. It was mostly just about the family. I gave this 4 stars. It was just a really interesting read. I read this for my nonfiction book club, and it was just good. Like it was really, really good. It was really interesting because you're learning all about like these 12 kids, which like is already just an excessive number of children, and then half of them were diagnosed with severe mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia, but there were several others, and there was one of the 6 who was mentally ill who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but like might not have actually had it. He might have been more on like the bipolar side of things. It was like the 80s, so mental health care was not amazing, and it was just a really, really interesting book, and it talked about the family and what it was like for, you know, the youngest sibling, who was, you know, 20 years younger than her oldest brother, to grow up in this household and to grow up surrounded by mental illness, and how she couldn't escape and how that affected her life. And it talked about like what happened to the brothers who were sick, and it talked about the parents and like their involvement, and they talked about schizophrenia care throughout the ages and kind of like the history of treatments and diagnoses. And it was just like an overall very, very interesting book. I will say, the thing, it was kind of odd, but I did enjoy this element, how little it was actually about schizophrenia, because it was kind of about everything surrounding schizophrenia, and then schizophrenia was like this hole in the middle that was never like fully discussed, because it was always talking about like how schizophrenia is treated and like what the science around it thinks, and like what people think causes schizophrenia, but not like what schizophrenia is. And it was about like this family with so many people diagnosed with it, but it was about like kind of how it affected the family and not the schizophrenia itself. And I think that was intentional, and it was such an interesting book, but I really, really loved it. Then I listened to Unbound: My Story of Liberation and the Birth of the Me Too Movement by Tarana Burke, who was the person who kind of created the Me Too movement, or one of them. This is her memoir. 4 stars, really interesting. I don't have tons to say about this one. Like, it was kind of like bordering on 3 and 4 stars for me. And I think one of the issues I had with it was the audiobook, because she reads it herself, and she does put on a performance for the audiobook, as like all audiobooks are performances. But she like really went hardcore on the performative aspects, and like upplaying her emotions and like her rage, and like shouting when like she was angry, and like sounding very upset when she was upset, and like stuff like that. And I've just found that I don't really like that in audiobooks. I like them read kind of straight and like not deadpan, but like I don't like a lot of drama in my narration. So I think I struggled with that, and I think someone who does enjoy that would really, really love this audiobook. It just wasn't for me in that format. And I do wonder how much that kind of affected my experience of like, I was listening to this and it felt kind of like hollow and performative, because like it is a performance, and it wasn't my thing. But that's like not a criticism of the book itself. I did like the way she dealt with emotion. She was very evocative with the emotion, and she did such a great job of capturing it like throughout her life, throughout her childhood and trauma, and then as she grew to adulthood and her advocacy, and like learning how to help other people while also like learning how to help herself and cope with her own sexual assault trauma. And it was just really interesting in a lot of ways. It just wasn't amazing for me. Like, really good, just like could have been better, and I do wonder how I would have felt about the physical book. Then I read Jim Abbott Against All Odds by Ellen Emerson White, which I did not read. This is just a children's biography of Jim Abbott, who was a baseball pitcher. And also he only had one hand, so that was interesting. I'd never heard of Jim Abbott. He was a little bit before my time because this was published in, I think, the early 90s. But he was very much, his career was like late 80s, early 90s, I think. And he was just a baseball pitcher. Ellen Emerson Wright wrote a couple of children's biographies of athletes that I am currently reading, and I'm not reading any of them because I'm clearly not the audience, but this was very enjoyable and very interesting, and I would be kind of curious to like read an in-depth adult biography of him because he sounds like an interesting person. Then I read my highlight of the month, The Necessary Hunger by Nina Revoyr. This is a young adult historical fiction novel set in the 80s about two girls who play basketball at their high schools. They're stars, like getting recruited by many colleges stars. One of them is Japanese American, one of them is African American, and their parents start to date and then they move in together. And it's just about these two girls who are kind of dealing with their friendship with each other, their rivalry with each other, and also their romantic feelings towards each other. And it's just so good. I gave it 5 stars. I really wanted to love Nina Revoyr, and I do so much. This book is not without flaws. I want to be very clear about that. And I am giving it 5 stars knowing full well that it has a great many of just like technical flaws in like the writing and the story development, because like it was one of those things where like there were too many characters and like everyone had friends who had friends who had friends, and it kind of like exploded the cast too much in a way that kind of felt superfluous for the story. The main character does a lot of eavesdropping, which is just like such a lazy way to like insert information that she doesn't really have any real justification for knowing. The sense of place wasn't great. Some of the dialogue and the scenes felt a little bit clunky, but it was like none of that mattered. Like I didn't care about any of that because the heart of the story was so good and the characters were so fantastic. Like I love reading young adult contemporaries or historical fictions where it feels real, like where the characters feel so real and they hit so close to home, and it's just like they're acting like the immature teenagers that they are. Like their logic makes sense, like they feel like real individuals, and I just fell in love. I love the main character, Nancy, and her growth, or like lack thereof in some cases, and I loved the way she dealt with her relationship with Raina, and I loved her relationship with her father and like what it's like to grow up as a Japanese American in a largely African American area. And I love the discussion of racism and interracial relationships because this is set in Los Angeles in the 80s, and like that is a very big issue in Los Angeles in the 80s and today, to be honest. But it just dealt with all of these things so well, in my opinion, and I love the relationship that was built between Nancy and Raina, and I love their feelings, and they're both gay, and it's dealt with so fantastically, and like so many of like their friends are also gay, and it's just like handled in an incredibly fantastic way. I love this so much. Like it's just like I can sit here and I could like rip this book apart in terms of like the flaws, and like I could like criticize it more, and maybe I should have rated it less. Like I was really planning to until I got to the ending, and then the ending just absolutely broke my heart. It was just so like the last few pages were just amazing. Like it was so much more than I expected, and it just hit me in the perfect way. Like I highly recommend this. I'm so looking forward to reading more from Nina Revoyr. I have more of her books on my shelf, and this was fantastic. This is one of my favorite books of the year. The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly. I read this for my 12-book project. This was recommended by my boyfriend. And let me just tell you that my expectations for this book were very, very wrong. I don't usually talk about like my expectations for a book in like my wrap-up, but I feel like it's relevant here because I thought this was a middle grade fantasy novel and it is a teen horror novel, and those are very different things. And I really thought it was a middle grade fantasy novel right up until we got to a bunch of bestiality, and then I was like, oh no, this is not for children. And that kind of changed my perception of the book a lot. How shall I describe this book? This is a young adult horror novel that's kind of like fairy tale-esque. It's a portal fantasy horror novel where this boy goes into this world that is full of fairy tales, but like dark, twisted, super messed up, gruesome fairy tales. There's a lot happening here. I gave this 4 stars, kind of despite myself, because this is not my kind of book, but it was honestly really well written. Like, I love the writing. I love the way he captured all these things. It was like grotesque and gruesome and detailed without being graphic, which I feel like was kind of like a fantastic thing to do. Like, there was all these like horrifying killings and stuff, but it was never like graphic, you know? Like, I was disgusted, but like he captured that feeling of disgust without actually like going too much in depth for like teenagers. Like, I could see like a 14-year-old really loving this book, which I think is what my boyfriend was when he first read this. Like, I can totally see why he loved it, and it's just super well done in that regard. My main issue is kind of like, it was a little bit too like quest driven for me, because he's in this fairy tale world and he has like an end goal, but like in between getting to his end goal, he hits like a lot of like small time fairy tale villains that he kind of has to like overpower and beat. And it just kind of felt like, oh, there'd be like this like super like 25 pages like super gruesome battle with like this villain who's murdering small children, and then that was never going to be mentioned again, and he's just gonna have another like 20-page battle with some other random villain. And then it kind of felt like it wasn't really building. It was just like multiple things were happening, and I didn't love that. I felt like it could have been more developed as a singular story instead of like a bunch of little kind of disconnected pieces. I don't love stories like that. I was also just a little bit mixed on the ending. I didn't dislike the ending, but I'm still not really sure how I felt about how he ended it. But it was just a really well done book. Like, not my thing. I am not the intended audience of this, but I do fully understand why people love it. And it is incredibly well written. And I would recommend it if you're looking for like YA, like fantasy horror stuff. I think this is a good one. Then I listened to Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and The Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods by Amelia Pang. This is a nonfiction book about forced labor in China, and kind of in general, but specifically Amelia Pang focused on China, and she focused on Falun Gong practitioners who were imprisoned in forced labor camps. And she also talked about how Americans contribute towards that, and just how the whole system works to support forced labor camps and prison camps. And it was really well done. Like, this book was fantastic. It was so good. It was so well researched. It wove together the individual story of a man who snuck a letter out of one of the prison camps that was later discovered by an American in some Halloween decorations, into the overall concept of forced labor and like what it means is on a worldwide scale. And it was just like tied together so well, and it was so well researched. I think my only main issue was that there was a lot going on. Like, she has this whole long section on Falun Gong and what it is, and like how the practitioners are oppressed in China. And I don't really know much about Falun Gong. Like, I don't. It kind of sounds like a cult to me, and she kept saying it wasn't, but it, not that I think they should be imprisoned, but it still sounds a little bit culty to me. But it was just kind of like not super the point of the book, and she had that a few times throughout the book where she would like delve really deep into like a specific topic that wasn't totally related to like the main point. And I kind of felt like if she was gonna do that, this book should be much longer, because I would have liked more focus on the forced labor and more research into that and just like more information. And it kind of felt like we were taking a bunch of these little sidetracks, which would work in a much longer book. But this book wasn't very long to begin with. So I think just structurally, it needed a little bit more, or it just needed more information. Because I think had she had more information and like built out the entire book, that would have fit a lot better. But it was really, really good. She talks about the politics, she talks about the history, she talks about various camps in China, how things have changed, how things are changing in the future, and what we can do to make things change more for the better. And it was really well done. Like, this is one of those books that I feel like is a must read, and I would highly, highly recommend people to read. She has an entire epilogue at the end that is specifically about like what we as individuals can do, like the specific steps that we can take to help things, which I feel like is very important. And it's just an incredibly worthwhile read. So like, if you get anything from this wrap up, it's probably that you should go read this book, because it's very educational, and I don't think it's like saying anything that you don't already know, but it is different to hear the details and like actually learn the specifics. So definitely please go read this book. Then I read Black Girls Must Die Exhausted by Jayne Allen, which is an adult contemporary novel about a 30-something woman who goes to a routine checkup at her gynecologist and finds out that she might possibly be infertile, or something close to infertile, which kind of puts a dent in her plan of like, am I dating the right person for me to get pregnant with if I need to get pregnant very, very soon? Like, is my career going the right way for it to go? Am I putting too much focus on that or not enough focus? And it's just about her as the Black woman feeling like she needs to have it all, and she's under so much stress trying to do everything. And it's 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It was a very good time. It's one of those books that is like a little bit obvious. Like, you can read the whole book like knowing where it's gonna go and knowing where it's gonna end up, but in like a good way. Like, when you watch a rom-com, like, you know what's gonna happen, like, you know the formula, but you're like in it for the good time, and this was very much a good time. I really loved the main character, I loved her friends, I loved the arc of the story. I think it was very well structured, it was very well done. I did not like the writing style so much. It's that very chatty first person perspective that I just don't like in anything. It's not my thing. I get that other people like it, I don't, and I struggled with that in this book, but I did really enjoy everything else, and the ending made me cry. It's a little bit of a cheap cry, but like, it made me feel good things, and I would definitely recommend this if you're looking for contemporaries like this that are just gonna make you feel things. Like, it's not overly sad, it's not overly happy, it's kind of good vibes all around, and I had a really, really good time with it. It is a trilogy, I believe, but I've heard mixed things about the other 2 books, and because I wasn't the biggest fan of the writing style, I think I'm just going to read this as a standalone that was really enjoyable. Then I read In the Ravenous Dark by A.M. Strickland, which is a young adult fantasy novel, which I was gonna say it's been a minute, but you know, I've kind of read a few fantasy novels lately, which is odd for me. But this is a young adult fantasy book that I got in my Waypoint subscription box, which is a recommendations-based subscription box from an indie bookseller. I will link their subscription down below. This is about a teenage girl in this fantastical society that I think was somewhat Greek-based, where they have blood magic and also death magic, and these 2 things kind of rule their society, and there's a lot of like twisted things happening. Like, blood magic is seen as kind of pure and death magic is seen as kind of corrupt, and she's trying to hide from, you know, the palace, like hide her blood magic, because she is an incredibly powerful blood magic person. She has a powerful lineage. I don't really know how to describe this. There was a lot going on. I give this 2 stars, which was unfortunate, because it's like, the idea behind this was really, really interesting. Like, the society that was created, the politics, the magic was all really, really cool. It's just that, like, this is not a particularly thick book. It's a standalone, and she's trying to do a lot. Like, she's trying to cover, you know, this main character who gets dumped into like a palace of corrupt individuals who are all trying to use her, and she doesn't understand the customs, and she's also trying to learn the magic that she's never really learned. And there's so much going on, and on top of that, there are 2 romances in this with the main character. She falls in love with 2 different people, which is like fine, but neither of them were developed, and there just like isn't time for the 6 different things that Strickland is trying to do in this novel. And it was like, if they'd focused on the politics, that would have been really cool. If they'd focused on the magic, that would have been really cool. If they'd focused on the romance, it probably wouldn't have been my thing, but like, it probably would have worked. It's just like, there was so much going on that none of it felt developed, and I hated the romance in this. I like a good subplot romance. I'm a big fan of subplot romances in anything, including YA. I love Sarah Dawson. But it didn't work here. Like, neither of the romances were developed enough that they didn't feel like relationships, and I kind of think I was supposed to feel like they were a relationship, but it was just pure insta-love. I hated the main character. She was so immature, and it's like, I wouldn't have had an issue with her immaturity if it had fit the character. Like, The Necessary Hunger, the main character of that book was so immature, like possibly more immature than this one, but it fit her character, it fit her story, and it made sense for her situation. In this, the main character has been kind of like half on her own, like raising herself, supporting herself. She's like in this palace by herself with no one to trust, and she'll walk up to someone and be like, hey, can I trust you? And that person says yes, and she's like, cool, I'm in love with you now. And it's just, it doesn't make sense. I hated her. I hated the romance. Politically and conceptually, it could have been so cool and interesting, and it was like the bones were there for this to be fantastic, and it was just such a failure. I was so disappointed. Like, I would have preferred if this was just like bad all around, but because there were so many like potentially good elements, it just made it worse. But yeah, this was disappointing. I really wanted to have more positive things to say about it. I Let You Go by Clare Mackintosh. This is a novel about a hit-and-run accident kills a small boy, and it's about kind of the cops and the mother and just the grief that's involved in this situation. And for the first half of the book, it's really quiet and slow and kind of just about grief and the crime itself, and then the second half gets way more into like the thrillery such and such. I gave this 3 stars. It's fine. Like, I enjoyed the first half a lot more, like when it was not a thriller, when it was just about a mother grieving her son's death. That was more interesting to me. I liked the development. I wanted more of that. And then in the second half, it kind of lost me. Like, it's not that it was bad. There were a lot of good elements in the second half. It just wasn't what I was interested in, and I struggled with it a lot. I don't know, it was like it just took a turn, and I just liked what it was doing before the turn better, but it wasn't bad. I would definitely read Clare Mackintosh again. I would hesitate to recommend this. I don't know that I would like seek her out, but I did enjoy her writing, and I liked some of her storytelling. I just didn't love all of her choices, which is fine, but this was a fine book. I have no issues with it. It's just super forgettable, honestly. Then my triumph of the month. I finally finished The Devil's Advocate's Greatest Closing Arguments in Criminal Law by Michael S. Lief and H. Mitchell Caldwell, which I've been reading since like June or July. This is just a collection of 8 legal cases that these 2 gentlemen believe make up the best closing arguments in criminal law history, and kind of like important cases that meant something. Like, they cover Miranda v. I forget what it was, but that came up with the Miranda rights in US legal system, which people are largely familiar with. I think that was the most obvious case. It also had John Adams defending the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre, which was very interesting. All of these were so interesting. It was a fascinating collection. I gave this 5 stars. I knew I was going to give this 5 stars. I gave the other 2 books in this trilogy, they're the same thing, essentially, 5 stars. I love them. They're so interesting. Like, I love reading about the cases because they have like the whole summary of the case and like what led up to it, like the trial, and then they have the text of the closing argument, so like you can read what the lawyers were actually saying and how it was so good. And I loved it. It is fascinating. Like, I could sit here and talk for so long about each of these cases individually, but like they covered lynching. Like, there was one case about like a sheriff's responsibility to protect the people in their prison that derived from a lynching that happened where a black man was killed, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's fascinating. Like, all of these things are just so interesting. I had an amazing time. So if you are at all interested in like pop law stuff, you'll learn a lot. It's very interesting. You read some legal stuff, it's very interesting. This is probably a very niche selection. But I love it. And it's like, now that I've finished the trilogy, I can think about like going back and rereading some of the cases from the other books that I really loved. Like Clare and Steru, who I think is like 5 cases or something between the 3 books, because these dudes are big fans of Clare and Steru apparently, which I am as well. Highly recommend this if it seems like your kind of thing. Then I listened to The Undocumented Americans by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. This is a nonfiction book about undocumented Americans. She herself was undocumented for a long time, became, I think, one of the dreamers, and maybe, but she is speaking from a perspective of someone who has been there, and she spoke with a lot of undocumented Americans and kind of a variety of stories, as well as weaving in her own story. And I gave this 4 stars. It was really lovely. Her writing is beautiful. Like, I listened to this via audiobook, but I do think I want to reread this physically, because some of her writing was just so well done, and it's just like, I would probably appreciate it so much more reading it physically. And it was just so powerful, and she's so full of emotion, and it's like at times she is so hopeful and positive, and it's like, these are wonderful people who can do wonderful things, and at other times she's so bitter and resentful, and it's just like all of these contradicting emotions work so well together in her story, or in the stories that she's telling of a variety of people that she's spoken with. And it's just a fantastic book. It's super short. It's a really good listen if you like audiobooks, and if not, it's just a super quick read. But I do think it's incredibly worthwhile, and I highly recommend picking it up. And then the last book that I finished in November was Eva Luna by Isabel Allende. My first full-length Isabel Allende novel. I gave it 4 stars. This is the story of Eva Luna, who is a young orphan girl in South America. It doesn't specify country. It's kind of like half gritty realism and half super fantastical magical realism, and it's very interesting. Like, it is an interesting combination. I am not certain that it always worked for me. I don't think it was bad. I just think at times it was not working for me. Magical realism and I don't always get along, and I do think I just kept wishing that this would be very real, like more real, make it more real, make it more realistic, make it grittier. Like, I want to read the real politics of this, not like kind of this almost ethereal, fantastical version of it. But it's really well written. I love the character of Eva Luna. I think the scope was also a little bit wide for me, because it was like fantastical, and it was combining all of these stories of different people in Eva Luna's life, and it was kind of a little bit odd and out there, and I don't know, it was beautiful, and the parts of it I loved. I really, really loved, but there was also so much of it that I wasn't sure about, and that I wasn't sure if I was enjoying it. So I gave it 4 stars because I do think it was very good and worthwhile, but it's such an odd book, and there are so many just like weird elements that don't make sense, but I enjoyed it. So it was a good first experience with Isabel Allende, and I do plan to read more from her. So would recommend this one, maybe not as like your first Allende. I would like to try some more and see if I have better experiences. Like, not that this was bad, it was just so odd, and like odd is not necessarily what I always go for, but I did enjoy this. And then I did have one DNF in November, The Bridge by Ian Banks, which I wasn't planning to DNF. I was planning to read this whole thing. It's like 288 pages, and I got to 195 pages. And at that point, I just realized how much I did not care. And I was like, I don't know what's going on, and I truly don't care to put in any more effort to try to figure out what's going on. Like, I don't want to know. I'm happier not knowing. So I just decided to say goodbye. I did not like the first Iain Banks book that I read, The Wasp Factory. I hated that. I had a thoroughly unpleasant experience. I think that one, I had a worse experience with that one, even though I finished it, than I did with this one. But I didn't like this one. It's weird. I don't even really know how to describe it because I don't know what it was doing, but it's kind of about this dude who gets into a car accident, and then he's kind of in a purgatory type place where there's this bridge. It doesn't do anything, it's just a bridge, but it's like this whole like society and city that's like weird stuff happening. He is a therapist, and then there are these like even weirder bits that are just in stream of conscious narration with different narrators who are like not characters in the story outside of that, and I didn't know what was happening, and I did not care. I did not care. If I could just read some descriptions from the summary of Goodreads on this book, let me just share what Goodreads has to say about it. It leads from nowhere to nowhere. Accurate. A truly accurate statement that I have nothing to contribute to. It also says devoid of personality. Again, accurate. I don't know what I expected. That pretty much describes the book. It's nothing. It's about nothing. It doesn't do anything. It's, I don't know, if you like super weird dreamlike stuff, maybe you would like it. It reminded me a little bit of The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, but just like worse in every way. I DNF'd it with less than 100 pages left, and I'm never going to think about it again. So that was everything that I read in November. I had a really wonderful reading month. Anytime I have 2 5-star reads in the same month, it's a fantastic reading month, and there were only 2 books that I actively disliked, so that's an absolute victory. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them if you have, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.